The dress had been hanging on my closet door for 3 weeks. Ivory silk with a modest neckline. Nothing flashy. I am not a flashy woman. But that morning, I pressed my hand flat against the fabric and stood there longer than I should have, because something in my chest was doing two things at once, swelling with pride and pulling with a weight I could not name yet. I am Marlise Good. And the morning my only son got married was the morning I learned that some people spend decades planning for a single moment. And that moment has nothing to do with love. I raised Alcy alone from the time he was 4 years old. That was when I lost Reuben, suddenly, violently, the way Atlanta takes people sometimes without warning or reason. One phone call and the man I had built my whole quiet life around was gone. What was left was a 4-year-old boy who had his father's eyes and a mother who had not finished her degree and had no blueprint for what came next. I did not break. I bent so many times I lost count, but I did not break. The years between that phone call and this morning were not glamorous years. They were early shifts and late invoices and school uniforms bought on the last week of the month. They were parent-teacher nights I attended alone and graduations I cried through without anyone beside me who remembered what it cost to get there. I learned to sign documents I did not fully understand and ask questions I was embarrassed to ask. And the only person outside of family who made that easier was a man named Oberon Cole. He had handled Hattie's affairs, Reuben's mother, after Reuben passed, and somewhere in those early years, he made it his quiet business to make sure I understood every paper I put my name to. I never forgot that. But this morning was not about those years. This morning was the proof that they had meant something. If you are watching this and you know what it is to raise a child alone, to be the only one clapping in an empty house, tell me where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments. Because this story is for you. Alcy had done everything right, built something real, loved a good woman, and called me every single Sunday without fail. Whatever I had given him, he had multiplied it. And today I was going to sit in a room full of people and watch him begin the rest of his life. I arrived at the venue just after noon. The space was beautiful. High ceilings, warm light, round tables dressed in cream and gold. I stood at the entrance and let myself feel it for exactly 1 moment. Then I started reading the room. The Hargrove side was already full, loud in the way that people are loud when they are comfortable, when they belong somewhere without having to earn it. They moved through the space like they had arranged it themselves, which, I would later understand, was closer to the truth than I knew. Their tables were near the front, near the wedding party, near Alcy. The laughter over there was easy and free. I was directed to a table near the back. The woman who guided me there smiled the whole time and said nothing specific, and I told myself it was just the seating arrangement. Families sit on their sides. That is how these things work. I told myself that twice. I found my place card and pulled out my chair and sat down. Smoothed the front of my ivory dress. Folded my hands on the table the way my mother taught me, like a woman who belongs wherever she sits. Then I looked down at the card in front of me, and the morning cracked straight down the middle. The words were printed. Not handwritten. Printed. Clean font. Centered on the card. The same size as every other name card on the table. That was the part that stopped my breath first, not the words themselves. The fact that someone had taken time to format them. Poor, uneducated mother living off her son. I read it twice. The second time my vision narrowed the way it does when your body understands something before your mind gives it permission to. I set the card down, flat, against the tablecloth. I pressed 2 fingers on top of it like I could keep it from existing if I held it still enough. The woman to my left leaned over. Hargrove sighed. I had already registered that. And she saw it. I watched her face open into something ugly and satisfied before she turned to the woman beside her and said something I could not hear. What followed was not loud. It was worse than loud. It moved along that table in murmurs and covered mouths, the kind of laughter that knows exactly what it is doing and chooses to do it quietly so there is no scene to point to later. I have been embarrassed in my life. I have been dismissed and overlooked and talked past. But I had never been mocked in a room I earned the right to sit in. There is a specific kind of shame that lives in that experience, the kind that does not burn hot. It burns cold, spreading from your chest into your hands until you cannot feel your fingers. I lifted my eyes from the table. Constance Hargrove was standing near the front of the room, beside a pillar, holding a glass of something sparkling. She was not scanning the room the way you do when you are waiting for something to happen. She was already looking at me, still, patient. The way you look at something you placed somewhere yourself and came back to check on. She was not checking whether it had landed. She already knew it had. In that single moment, her eyes on mine, that stillness in her face, that almost imperceptible lift at the corner of her mouth, I understood that this was not a mistake. Not a vendor error. Not a seating coordinator who misread a note. Someone had typed those words. Someone had approved that font. Someone had placed that card at that specific seat, and then positioned herself across the room to watch me find it. I did not know yet why. I did not know the full history that had traveled 30 years to arrive at this table. But I knew what deliberate looked like. I had spent enough years reading rooms, reading documents, reading the fine print on papers that other people assumed I would not understand. I knew the difference between an accident and a decision. I pushed my chair back. I was not going to cry. I was not going to make a sound. I was simply going to stand up, walk out of that room with my ivory dress and my dignity, and find somewhere private to come apart before I came back together. That was the plan forming in the 3 seconds it took me to place both hands flat on the table and begin to rise. I was the woman who signed the papers on this family's foundation. While Constance Hargrove was busy deciding what font to use on a name card, I was signing documents that built something real. She did not know that yet. In that moment, neither exchange had happened. There was only the card and the cold laughter and a woman across the room who had been waiting 30 years for this exact second. I got halfway to standing, and then a hand closed over mine. His hand was warm, and it was steady, and it did not let go. I looked up, and Alcy was crouched beside my chair, eye level with me, the way he used to crouch beside me when he was small and wanted my full attention. He was in his wedding suit, deep navy, pocket square pressed flat. Every inch of him the man I had worked myself hollow to raise. His eyes went to my face first. Then they dropped to the table. He read the card. I watched him read it, and I watched his face do the opposite of what most people's faces do when they are angry. It did not flush. It did not tighten around the jaw. It went still. Completely, dangerously still. The way water goes quiet just before something beneath it moves. He straightened up slowly. He picked up the card between 2 fingers, looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, then set it back down. He did not say a word to me. He did not ask if I was all right. He already knew the answer, and he was already deciding what came next. He turned and walked back toward the head table. The room had not fully registered what was happening yet. Conversations continued in patches. Glasses clinked. And then Alcy reached the head table, picked up his own place card, and turned around. That was when the room noticed. He walked back across that floor like the space belonged to him, unhurried, deliberate, every step landing with quiet intention. People stop talking in the way that people stop talking when something is happening, that they cannot look away from, but do not yet understand. By the time he reached my table and pulled out the chair beside me and sat down, the nearest conversations had dissolved entirely. He placed his name card on the table next to mine. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a room recalibrating. Everyone present quietly revising what they thought they understood about who held power in this space. Al C. looked across the room at Constance Hargrove. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He simply looked at her with that still face and said, clearly enough for the tables nearest to hear, "You just made the most expensive mistake of your life." Constance's smile did not break. I will give her that much. She was practiced enough that the smile stayed in place, but something behind it shifted, a micro-movement in her eyes, a barely perceptible stillness that replaced the satisfaction that had been sitting there moments before. She had planned for embarrassment. She had not planned for this. I did not look at Constance after that. I looked at Noelle. My son's bride was seated at the head table where Alcy had just been. She had watched him stand. She had watched him walk. She had watched him sit beside me in front of every person in that room. And she had not moved. Not 1 inch. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and her face was composed, and she was completely, perfectly still. That stillness told me everything I needed to know about what Noelle Hargrove had known and chosen not to stop. The reception finished the way damaged things sometimes finish. On the surface, intact. Music played. Food was served. Conversations restarted with the careful brightness of people who witnessed something they were not going to discuss openly. I sat beside my son and ate and said very little and felt the room's recalibration settling around us like weather changing. When the last guests filtered out and the venue grew quiet, Alcy stood beside me and helped me with my wrap. Then he said, without looking up, "I need to talk to Noelle, privately, tonight." He was not asking my opinion. He was telling me what was about to happen next. They walked to the back of the parking lot where the lights were dim and the last of the catering staff were loading a van too far away to hear anything. I watched them from the venue doorway for just a moment. My son in his navy suit and his bride in her wedding dress standing on asphalt. And then I went inside and let them have it. What I know of that conversation came from Alcy. He told me everything the next morning, the way he has always told me things, plainly, without decoration, the way a man speaks when he was raised by a woman who taught him that honesty is not cruelty. Alcy did not open with the card. He opened with a question. He asked Noelle, "Did you know?" Not did you know about the card specifically, just did you know? And the fact that she understood immediately what he meant told him something before she said a word. She said she did not know about the card. He believed her, but he told her that was not actually the question he needed answered. The question he needed answered was whether she had seen her mother's behavior across the months of their engagement and chosen to manage it instead of address it. Whether she had decided, at some point, that keeping the peace was more important than telling him the truth about what was running underneath the surface of every family dinner they had sat through together. Noelle was quiet for a long time. Then she said, 3 months ago, your mother came to the venue walkthrough and my mother made a comment afterward. She stopped, started again. She said, some women raise sons, and some women hold on to them, and the ones who hold on always find a way to make themselves the victim. Alcy let that sit in the air between them. Noelle said, I told myself she was just being difficult, that it was old tension about something I didn't need to understand. I thought if I just got us to the wedding, it would settle down on the other side. Alcy said, "And you didn't ask me." It was not an accusation. It was quieter than that. The kind of sentence that lands harder precisely because there is no anger in it. Noel said, "No, I didn't ask you." He told her he believed that she loved him. He was not standing in that parking lot questioning that. What he was questioning was whether she understood that loving him meant his mother was not negotiable, not a variable to be managed, not a complication to be smoothed over until it became someone else's problem to explain. His mother was the reason he was standing in that parking lot in a suit that fit. She was the reason there was anything worth marrying into. And a woman who had been slowly, quietly positioned as a punchline at her own son's wedding. I deserved better than a future daughter-in-law who saw it coming from 3 months out and said nothing. Noelle did not argue. She did not defend herself with the parts that were true. That she had not placed the card, had not laughed, had not wanted any of it. She understood, in the way that honest people understand hard things, that innocence and responsibility were not the same category. She said, "What do you need?" Alcy said, "Time. I need time to think." Then he said, "The wedding is not happening tomorrow, Noelle." She nodded once. She did not cry in front of him, or if she did, he did not include that detail when he told me, and I did not ask. He walked her to her car. He waited until her taillights disappeared around the corner of the lot. Then he drove to my house. The kitchen light was on when I came downstairs. Alcy was at my table in the same navy suit, jacket folded over the back of the chair, top button open. He had not slept. I could see it in the particular stillness of a person who has been sitting alone with their thoughts for hours, not restless, just settled into something they have already decided. I did not ask if he was all right. I filled the kettle and set it on the burner and sat down across from him. He told me everything. The parking lot, the question, Noelle's answer, the comment Constance had made 3 months before the wedding. He told it the way he tells hard things, in order, without editorializing, leaving space for me to absorb each piece before the next one landed. When he finished, the kettle was boiling. I got up, made 2 cups, set one in front of him. Then I sat back down and he looked at me across the table and asked me something I had been waiting, on some level, for almost 2 years. He said, "Did you know who her mother was?" When I first brought Noelle home. I wrapped both hands around my cup. I said, "I recognized the name Hargrove the first time you said it." He did not react immediately. He just watched me. I told him the truth in full, that I had seen Constance at that first dinner and known exactly who she was. That I had said nothing because it was not my relationship to complicate. It was his life, his choice, his future. That I had decided to watch and wait and see whether the woman had grown into something different from what I remembered. That I had spent almost 2 years giving her the benefit of a doubt she was apparently never interested in earning. The name card had answered every question I was still holding. Alcy was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the same way he has nodded since he was a boy when something confirms what he already suspected, but hoped was wrong. He picked up his phone. He called Oberon Cole at 6:47 in the morning without any apparent concern about the hour. Cole picked up on the second ring, which told me he had been expecting the call. Alcy's side of the conversation was 11 sentences. I counted without meaning to. He said, "Run the full review, everything attached to the Caldwell property and the Hargrove merger proposal. I need it on paper by end of week." He listened for a moment. Then he said, "All of it, Oberon. Every document with either name on it." He ended the call and set the phone face down on the table. Then he looked at me and said, "Cole is handling the vendor contracts too. I'm covering the costs." I started to speak and he shook his head once. "It's already decided, Mama." That was all. No discussion. No invitation to argue the point. He said it the way he says most hard things, like the decision had been made somewhere private and quiet long before the words came out, and the words were simply the notification. We sat together in my kitchen while the sun came up outside the window and the street outside began its slow morning sounds. We did not talk much after that. There was a particular kind of peace in the silence, not comfortable exactly, but clean. The peace of people who have said the true things and do not need to fill the space around them. Across the city, in a house I had not been inside in 30 years, Constance Hargrove picked up her phone before she had finished her first cup of coffee. Her family's attorney was calling. Let me tell you what Constance Hargrove did not know. When Reuben passed, his mother, Hattie Caldwell, did what grieving mothers do when they have nothing left to hold on to. She held on to what she could still protect. She could not bring her son back. She could not undo the randomness of what Atlanta had taken from her, but she could make sure that the woman who had loved him and the child they had made together were never left standing on ground that belonged to someone else. Hattie worked with Oberon Cole for 2 years after Reuben's death. Quietly, carefully, the way women of her generation handle serious things, without announcement, without asking anyone's permission. She established a trust for Alcee, and then she did something else. She had a property on the south side of Atlanta, land that had been in the Caldwell family for decades. And she made a decision about it that she told me directly and only once. She said, "Alcee will build his own. This is yours. You earned it by staying." She deeded that property to me, not to Alcee, to me. Filed through Jefferson County Probate Court. Every document signed, every line recorded. Oberon Cole sat across from me at his desk and walked me through every page until I could have explained it to someone else. I signed my name 11 times that afternoon. I have never forgotten that number. That property is where Alcee's business operates from today. The building he built his company inside sits on land that carries my name on the deed. Not his, mine. Now let me tell you what the Hargrove family had been building toward. For the better part of 18 months, Linwood Hargrove's business interests had been positioning for a merger with Alcee's company. It was never announced. It was the kind of arrangement that moves through handshakes and referrals and Sunday dinners. The kind of deal that wealthy families construct slowly so that by the time anyone puts it on paper, it already feels inevitable. The discussions were still in their exploratory structuring phase. Formal financing had not been assembled. Collateral review had not begun. No title work had been commissioned. And the full due diligence process that verifies ownership and supporting assets had not yet been triggered. At that stage, the proposals were built largely on disclosures, assumptions, and future asset discussions. But the working assumption beneath several of the preliminary proposals was that the Caldwell property would eventually form part of the asset picture Alcee could bring to the table. Constance's attorney had run a holding search on Alcee, standard procedure for the stage they were in. He found the business, the accounts, the equipment. He found everything a man builds when his mother built the ground beneath him first. What he did not find was the deed. Because the land itself was not yet under formal review, and because Constance had told him, and I know this now, though I did not know it that morning, that Marlise Good was not relevant to the transaction. She was the mother. She did not need to be searched. The attorney's review remained focused on Alcee's disclosed business interests because no formal asset verification process had yet expanded beyond him. The contempt was the blind spot. She called me poor on that card. But the merger she had been engineering for a year and a half was moving forward on assumptions she never bothered to verify, because she had already decided I was not worth looking at. If anyone in that story was counting on someone else's foundation, it was the Hargroves. They were preparing proposals around land they never thought to examine closely, because they never thought the answer would be attached to my name. She called me uneducated. I did not finish my degree. That is true. I finished something else instead. I finished raising a son alone from the time he was 4 years old. I managed trust documentation for over a decade. I maintained a property deed, kept it clean, kept it current, and built a paid-off house on land that has carried my name since Alcy was in middle school. I do not know what Constance Hargrove's definition of education is. I know what mine is. Oberon Cole had everything on paper by Thursday. By Friday morning, Constance Hargrove walked into her husband's home office and closed the door behind her. My phone rang on a Saturday afternoon, 4 days after the wedding that did not happen. I did not recognize the number. I answered anyway, the way I have always answered unknown numbers, because Ruben's mother taught me that important calls do not always come from familiar places. The voice on the line said, "Marlise, this is Linwood Hargrove." I sat down. He did not open with an explanation or a preamble. He said, "I'm not calling about the business. I'm not calling about Alcy. I'm calling because I owe you something I should have paid a long time ago." He paused. Then, I knew. Not about the card specifically, but I knew what Constance was carrying, and I told myself it was old history that would burn itself out. I should have addressed it. I didn't. That's on me. The call was 4 minutes long. I know because I looked at the screen when it ended. Linwood Hargrove is not a man who knows how to say hard things at length. But he said the one hard thing he owed me. And he said it without dressing it up or asking me to make it easier for him. I will give him that. I thanked him and I hung up. Then I sat with what the call actually was. Because there is a difference, a significant, specific difference, between a man who stops his wife and a man who calls afterward to say he should have. Linwood had known for the length of his marriage that something ugly lived underneath Constance's surface, where my name was concerned. He had chosen comfort. He had chosen the path that let him sleep without confrontation and let Constance carry her wound unexamined until it found its way onto a printed name card at his own daughter's wedding. His apology was genuine. It was also 30 years too late to have prevented anything. I did not say that to him, but I knew it. And knowing it mattered for what I did next. I called Oberon Cole myself, not through Alcy. My phone, my call, my question. I asked him directly, was there anything attached to the trust or the deed that Hattie needed to be informed about before it became part of any public record or legal proceeding? Cole was quiet for a moment in the way he gets quiet when the answer is yes, and he is deciding how to frame it. Then he said, "There are 2 instruments attached to the original trust that reference the property transfer. If the merger dissolution moves through formal channels, those documents will surface in discovery." I told him I understood. I told him I would handle Hattie myself. He said, "Marlise, just my name. The way he has said it for 20 years when he wants me to know he means what comes next. She should hear it from you." I already knew that. But it mattered that he said it. What I learned from Noelle later, weeks after, when she and I had found our way to something that resembled honest conversation, was what had happened inside Linwood's office that Friday morning. The attorney's findings had come through on a call Linwood took alone. When Constance came in and closed the door, he was already sitting at his desk, with the information in front of him. He did not yell. He said one thing. "You told Graves not to search her name." Constance said nothing. And Linwood said, 30 years, Constance. And you still could not let it go. Noelle had been in the hallway. She heard every word through that door. And standing there in that hallway, she understood for the first time that the thing unraveling around her had not begun at a wedding reception with a name card. It had begun somewhere she had never been, with people she had never known. Long before she was born. Noelle did not wait until the next day. She walked away from that hallway door, sat in her car for 20 minutes, and then walked back inside and found her mother in the kitchen. This is what she told me later. That she needed the 20 minutes not to calm down, but to decide how honest she was willing to be. She decided all the way. She said, I need you to tell me who Marlise Good is to you. Constance set down what she was holding. She said, that is ancient history, Noelle. Noelle said, then it should be easy to explain. Constance moved to the other side of the kitchen the way people move when they want to appear casual and are not. She said they had gone to college together, that they had been close once, that things had ended badly and she had moved on decades ago. Noelle said, Dad said you told your attorney not to search her name. That is not moving on. That is making sure she stays small enough that you never have to reconsider what you decided about her. Constance's jaw tightened. Noelle said, 3 months before my wedding, you said something about Alcie's mother. You said some women raise sons, and some women hold on to them. I let it go. I should not have let it go. What did you mean? Constance said, I meant what I said. Noelle said, you mentioned a name that day. You said it under your breath. I didn't catch it then. I'm catching it now. Whose name was it? The kitchen went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when the person in them has run out of deflections. Constance said, Reuben. Noelle had never heard that name from her mother's mouth. Not once in her entire life. She told me later that hearing it felt like a door opening into a room she had not known existed in a house she thought she knew completely. She said, Who was Reuben? And Constance told her. Not generously. There was nothing generous in how she told it. But she told it. A man she had loved in college. A man who had chosen Marlise instead of her. A woman Constance had helped, had supported, had considered her closest friend, who had taken the one thing Constance wanted without, in Constance's telling, a moment's consideration for what it cost. She talked about watching them build something together, watching Marlise get pregnant, watching them both leave school. Constance had told herself she was done with both of them. And then Reuben had died, and the story she had been telling herself, that they had chosen wrong and would eventually pay for it, had no ending anymore. It just stopped, mid-sentence, leaving her holding a grievance against a woman whose life had already cost more than Constance had ever been willing to count. Noelle listened to all of it. Then she asked the question quietly. She said, Did you know he died? Constance said, I heard. 2 words. Flat and contained, the way you speak about weather in a city you no longer live in. No grief, no softening. Not even the performance of indifference, just actual indifference, worn so smooth by 30 years of maintenance that it had become the truth of her. Noelle stood in that kitchen and looked at her mother and understood something that could not be untrue once she understood it. Constance had known Reuben Caldwell was dead, had known Marlise was left alone with a child, had known all of it, and had spent the next 30 years nursing a wound against a widow. The silence between them after those 2 words was the longest silence Noelle had ever shared with her mother. It was the first honest one. Hattie Caldwell has lived in the same house on Delmar Drive for 41 years. The porch still has the same swing Reuben used to sit on as a boy. She has never moved it. I do not know if that is grief or stubbornness, or simply the particular piece of a woman who decided long ago that some things stay where they are. I drove there on a Tuesday morning without calling first. Not because I was being careless, but because Hattie is the kind of woman who prepares herself when she knows company is coming. And I did not want her to prepare. I wanted her to receive what I was bringing exactly as it was. She opened the door before I reached the top porch step. She looked at my face and said, "Come inside. I'll put the kettle on." She already knew something was coming. She has always been that way, reading weather in people the way farmers read it in sky. I sat at her kitchen table and I told her everything. The legal review, the documents Cole had flagged, the merger the Hargroves had been building, the deed instruments that would surface if the dissolution moved through formal channels. I told it plainly and in order the way she has always preferred to receive hard information. No softening, no circling. Just the facts laid out like documents on a table. Hattie listened with both hands wrapped around her cup. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I always knew that land would matter eventually. I just didn't know what for." She was not surprised. She was something past surprise. A woman who had outlived her son and built her protection in the only direction still available to her, and had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for the thing she built to finally be called upon. I told her I was sorry she was being pulled into it. She shook her head once. She said, "Don't apologize for that. Let me tell you why I did what I did." She set her cup down. She said, "It was 2013. Alcy was in 10th grade. You had that problem with the landlord. The man trying to claim the back section of your property wasn't covered under your lease agreement." She paused. "I watched you go down to that county office by yourself. No lawyer, no Alcy, nobody. You sat in that waiting room for 4 hours, and then you went in there, and you explained that lease clause back to that man in his own language until he had nothing left to say. You came out of that building and you called me and you said, 'Miss Hattie, I think I handled it.' And you had. Completely. By yourself." She looked at me across the table. "That was the week I called Oberon and told him to start the paperwork. Because I understood something that day that I had been circling around for years. Alcy was going to be fine. He was Reuben's son, determined and capable, and the world was going to find ways to open for him. But you." She stopped. Started again, more quietly. "You needed something that was simply yours, something that had no man's name attached to it. Something nobody could look at and say, you only have it because of who you loved." The kitchen held that for a moment the way good rooms hold important things. I did not cry. I wanted to. But Hattie is not a woman you cry in front of unless she invites it. And she had not invited it. So I held it and I nodded. And I told her I understood. I stood to leave. Hattie walked me to the door. Then she said, with her hand on the frame, "Before you go, a girl called me last week. Said her name was Noelle Hargrove. Said she found my number through her father." I turned around. She wanted to know about Reuben. I sat back down. Hattie came away from the door and settled into her chair the way she does when she has decided something deserves to be told properly. She refilled both cups without asking. Then she folded her hands on the table and told me about the call. Noelle had called on a Thursday evening. She introduced herself fully, her name, how she knew Alcy, how she got the number. Hattie said she appreciated that. She said most young people today begin conversations in the middle and expect you to find the beginning yourself. Noelle started at the start. She asked Hattie 3 questions. Who was Reuben? What was he like? And this was the one that broke something open in Hattie. What would he have wanted for his son? Hattie said that 3rd question was the one nobody had ever asked her. Not in 30 years. People asked how she was doing. People asked about Alcie's progress, his grades, his business. People talked around Ruben the way you talk around a piece of furniture that has been in a room so long you have stopped seeing it. Noelle asked about him directly. As a person, as a father who never got to be one. And something in Hattie that had been held carefully for 30 years simply opened. She talked for 2 hours. This is what Hattie told her. This is what I am telling you now. Because Ruben Caldwell deserves to exist in this story as something more than an absence. He was funny in the specific way that quiet people are funny. The kind of humor that arrives without warning and lands before you have time to prepare for it. He argued about everything. Not combatively. He just needed to understand the other side of a thing completely before he could accept it. And the process of understanding looked like disagreement from the outside. He was afraid of failure, in the particular way that people are afraid of it when they grew up watching someone they loved work very hard for very little. He did not talk about that fear, but it lived in him, and Hattie knew it because she had put it there without meaning to. He loved Marlise the way serious people love, quietly and with his whole attention. Hattie said she knew it was real the first time she watched him listen to me talk. She said most men listen with the part of their brain that is already preparing the response. Ruben listened with everything he had. She said she told him once, "You listen to that girl like she is telling you something you need to remember." He said, "She usually is." He was not perfect. He spent money badly in his early 20s, and it took Hattie sitting him down twice before it changed. He was late to most things that were not important to him, and early to everything that was. He held grudges longer than was useful, and apologized slower than was comfortable. He was someone's specific, flawed, irreplaceable son, and he never got to be Alcie's father. Hattie said that when Noelle asked what Ruben would have wanted for his son, she did not answer immediately. She thought about it properly. Then she said, he would have wanted his son to be loved by someone who was willing to go looking for the truth, even when it was hard to find. Hattie looked at me across the table. She said, that girl drove herself to look for it. She found my number, she called me, and she asked the right questions. That is not nothing, Marlise. I drove home with Ruben sitting in the car with me the way he sometimes does, not as grief, just as presence. Alcie did not know Noelle had called Hattie. As I pulled into my driveway, I understood that I was now holding something that would change things when I gave it to him. The question was when. Alcie came for dinner on Wednesday. He did not know I had anything specific to tell him. I had called and said, come eat, the way I have always called, and he came the way he has always come. That normalcy was deliberate on my part. I needed him sitting at my table, fed and settled, before I gave him something that would rearrange him. I waited until the plates were cleared. I told him about Noelle's call to Hattie. I told it the way Hattie told it to me. In order, without editorializing. The 3 questions, the 2 hours. What Hattie said about Ruben listening. What Hattie's answer was when Noelle asked what his father would have wanted for his son. Alcie sat with his hands flat on the table and said nothing for a long time. I know my son's silences. There is the silence of anger, which has a particular quality of compression to it, like something being pressed down that wants to rise. There is the silence of hurt, which goes inward and makes him seem smaller. This silence was neither. This was the silence of a man in whom something is quietly rearranging itself, shifting furniture in a room that has been arranged one way for a long time. I let it run its full length. Then I said, I am not telling you what to do with it. I am telling you who she is underneath what her mother raised her to be. What you do with that is yours. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at me and said, You went to Hattie yourself. I said. She needed to hear it from me. He looked at me for a moment, the way he sometimes looks at me, like he is calculating something and the number keeps coming out larger than he expected. Then he said, "What else?" He knows me. He has always known when there is a second thing. I told him about the document Cole had flagged. 18 months ago, during the early stages of the merger discussions, Alcy had signed a proposal framework that referenced the Caldwell property as a future collateral instrument. A formality, Cole had called it at the time. The kind of paper that gets signed at the beginning of conversations to signal good faith. The proposal was preliminary. No financing package had been assembled, no collateral review had been initiated, and none of the formal title verification that comes later in a transaction had taken place yet. The document had come through a stack of early framework papers reviewed at the time by counsel and treated as non-binding. Alcy had read the proposal itself, but not given particular attention to a collateral reference he believed would never become operative unless the deal advanced into formal due diligence. He told me that plainly, without excuse. He had trusted the process and assumed later verification stages would catch anything requiring closer review. Cole's assessment was clear. The document was not legally binding because the property was never Alcy's to offer. You cannot pledge what you do not own. But the document existed. It had Alcy's signature on it. And when the merger dissolution moved through formal channels, that signature would be visible and would require a formal release to be properly extinguished. Alcy was quiet again. Different quality this time. The compressed kind. He said, "I signed something I didn't fully read." I said, "Cole says it doesn't hold, but it needs to be dissolved properly." He said, "Which means a meeting." I said, "Which means a meeting." Cole had already received a formal request from the Hargroves' attorney, not to negotiate terms, not to salvage the merger, but to sit across a table and understand the full scope of what their proposal had actually been built on. Alcy said he was going. His voice carried the particular flatness of a decision that has been made so completely that discussing it further would be a waste of breath. I asked him if he wanted me there. He looked at me across my own kitchen table, the same table where he had sat in yesterday's suit 10 days ago, and made the first phone call that started all of this. He said, "It's your name on the deed. It should be your name in the room." The attorney meeting lasted 40 minutes. I will not give it more space than it deserves, because it did not deserve more space than it took. We sat across a conference table, Alcy, Oberon Cole, and I on one side, Linwood and their attorney on the other. Constance was not there. I noted that without comment. The attorney laid out what the review had found. Cole responded with what the documents confirmed. The merger proposal was formally dissolved by mutual acknowledgement. Alcy's signature on the collateral document was formally released. Everything that had been built on an assumption was dismantled with the quiet efficiency of people who have accepted that the building was never sound. Linwood did not look at me directly during the meeting. Once, when Cole read the property deed holder's name into the record, Linwood's jaw moved in a way that had nothing to do with speech. That was the only moment that felt like anything other than procedure. We were in the parking lot by 11:15. 3 days later, someone knocked on my front door at 2:30 in the afternoon. I was not expecting anyone. I came to the door the way I come to unexpected doors, unhurried, reading the shape of the shadow through the glass before I turned the handle. Noelle Hargrove was standing on my porch alone. No Alcy, no call ahead, no arrangement of any kind. Just the girl in a plain shirt and jeans with her hands held in front of her, and her face carrying the particular openness of someone who has rehearsed nothing and decided that was the only honest way to do this. I opened the door fully and waited. She said, "I know you don't owe me this conversation, I came anyway because I didn't know what else to do that was true. I said nothing. I kept my hand on the door. She said, I want to say first that I know what I did not do. I am not here to explain my mother's history to you as though that explains anything about me. I am not here to tell you about the card. You know about the card. What I want to say is that I saw something running underneath the surface of my mother's behavior for 18 months, and I made a decision, over and over, to manage it instead of confront it. I told myself I was keeping the peace. What I was actually doing was choosing my own comfort over your dignity. I know the difference now. She stopped. She was not crying, but she was close to it, and she was not going to let herself, which I respected. She said, I called Miss Hattie because I needed to understand what I was asking you to accept. Not just as Alcie's mother. As a person who has been carrying things I had no idea about and didn't bother to ask about. She paused. She told me about Reuben. She told me what you did alone, and I sat with all of it and I kept asking myself one question. I waited. She said, Is there a version of this where I am someone you can look at without seeing my mother's name? The porch was quiet. Somewhere down the street, a car passed. The ordinary world continuing its ordinary business around a moment that was anything but. I looked at this girl, this woman, who had driven herself to an address she had no guarantee would receive her, who had called an old woman she did not know to ask about a man she had never met, who was standing on my porch having rehearsed nothing because she had decided honesty was the only currency that had any value left. I thought about what Hattie said. That girl drove herself to look for the truth. I did not answer her question with words. I opened the door wider. I said, Come inside. 3 months is enough time for the truth about a person to travel. The merger dissolution did not make any headlines. It did not need to. In the circles, the Hargroves moved in. The kind of circles where business arrangements are discussed at dinner tables before they ever reach boardrooms. The news moved the way those things always move. Quietly, completely, and with the particular velocity of information that powerful people find embarrassing. Constance and Linwood's social circle did not abandon them loudly. It simply contracted. Invitations that had previously arrived without thought began arriving with less frequency. Conversations at the events they did attend carried the careful brightness of people who knew something and had agreed not to say it directly. I watched none of this firsthand. I learned pieces of it from Noelle over the weeks she and Alcie spent carefully rebuilding what the wedding day had fractured. They were not rushing. They were not performing recovery for anyone's benefit. They were two people who had decided the thing between them was worth the patience it required, and they were being patient. Hattie met Noelle for the first time at her kitchen table 6 weeks after the door on my porch opened. She called me afterward and said 3 words. She'll do fine. From Hattie Caldwell, that is not a small thing. I spent those 3 months doing what I have always done best. I stayed out of the way of things that needed to find their own level, and I stayed close to things that needed tending. I watched my son move back towards something steady, and I did not interfere with the moving. Then one Tuesday afternoon, Noelle called me. Not about Alcie. She called to tell me something she felt I should know before it happened. She said, I told my mother I came to your house. I didn't ask her permission. I told her afterward because she needed to know. She paused. She didn't speak to me for 2 weeks, but this morning she asked me for your address. I wrote it down for her. I want to be honest about what I felt in the 3 days between that call and the knock on my door. It was not anticipation. It was not dread. It was the particular stillness of a woman who has already survived the hard parts and is simply waiting to see what shape the last piece takes. Constance came alone on a Friday morning. No Linwood. No preparation visible in her face beyond the specific effort of a woman who has decided to do something that costs her and has not allowed herself to reconsider it on the drive over. She stood on my porch and she did not open with the wedding. She did not open with the card. She said, "I have been carrying something for 30 years that was never yours to carry the consequences of. I am sorry for that." She did not stop there. She said, "Noelle deserves better than what I showed her, not just at that wedding. For the 18 months before it, when I was building something ugly underneath every family dinner we sat through together. She was watching me, and I was teaching her something I had no right to teach her." Her voice was steady. She had not come to fall apart on my porch. She had come to say true things, and she was saying them. Then she said, "When Reuben died, I told myself it didn't matter to me. I told myself that every day for 30 years, until I had told it so many times, it felt like the truth. The name card was what happens when a lie gets heavy enough. It finds a way out." The porch was quiet. I looked at Constance Hargrove, this woman who had carried a wound for 30 years and aimed it at everyone except herself. And I said, "I heard you." Nothing more, nothing less. She nodded once. She walked back to her car. That evening, my phone rang. "Alcy," he said. "Noelle said yes again, Mama." The dress was different this time. Not ivory. Deep burgundy, fitted at the waist, the kind of color a woman wears when she is done being careful about taking up space. I stood in front of my mirror, and I did not press my hand against the fabric the way I had 9 months ago. I looked at myself directly, and I said, out loud, to no one but the room, "You earned this morning." Then I picked up my bag, and I went. The venue Alcy and Noelle chose was a converted farmhouse 40 minutes outside the city. No grand ballroom, no arranged sides. Round tables set in a single connected space where the Good family and the Hargrove family would sit among each other without architecture telling them they were separate. That choice, that specific, deliberate erasure of the division that had defined the first attempt, had been Noelle's idea. Alcy told me that when he described the space. I did not say anything, but I noted it. I arrived to find Hattie Caldwell already seated in the front row. She was dressed in deep green with a hat that her mother had owned before her. She had told me once that she saves it for the days that matter. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her eyes moving over the room with the quiet authority of a woman who has outlasted everything that tried to diminish her and arrived here anyway. I sat beside her, and she took my hand without looking at me and held it. She said, still looking forward, "He would have loved this day." I said, "I know." We did not need more than that. Oberon Cole was seated 2 chairs down. Alcy had called him personally, not through an office line, but on his cell, the way you call someone when the invitation is not professional but personal. Cole had shown up in a suit that told me he understood the distinction. He nodded at me when I sat down. I nodded back. 20 years of documents and phone calls and hard conversations sitting between us, and all of it collapsed into one nod that said everything it needed to say. The Hargrove side of the room was smaller. Some faces that had been at the first gathering were absent from this one. No explanation had been offered, and none was required. Constance and Linwood were there, seated together near the middle, not at the front, not at the back. Constance was wearing navy, and she was quieter than I had ever seen her in a room. Not diminished exactly, settled. The way a person looks when they have put something down that they carried too long and their posture has not yet fully adjusted to the lightness. When the ceremony began, the room went still in the way that rooms go still when something true is happening. Alcy stood at the front and watched Noelle come to him, and his face did the thing I had been waiting my whole life to see it do. It opened. completely and without reservation. The careful stillness I had watched him maintain across 9 months of hard things, dissolving into something unguarded and full. He looked at Noelle the way Hattie once told me Reuben used to look at me, like she was telling him something he needed to remember. I felt Reuben in that moment. Not as absence. I want to be clear about that. Not as the hollow that his dying left. As continuation. As the specific way that love does not end when a person ends but moves forward through the people they made and the choices those people make. Alcy was Reuben's continuation. And he was choosing well. At the reception, when the music began and the room loosened into celebration, I was watching Hattie laugh at something Oberon Cole said when I noticed movement across the room. Constance had risen from her seat. She was walking toward my table. Constance pulled out the chair across from me and sat down without asking if she could. I respected that. Asking would have made it performative. She simply sat. The way you sit across from someone when you have already decided the conversation is necessary, and politeness is beside the point. The reception moved around us. Music, laughter, the particular warmth of a room full of people who came because they wanted to be there, and not because the invitation required it. Alcy and Noelle were on the floor, moving together with the easy comfort of two people who had chosen each other twice and knew the weight of both choosings. Hattie was at the table behind me talking to Oberon Cole about something that was making her laugh. I noted all of it in my peripheral vision and kept my eyes on Constance. She said, "I need to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Was there ever a moment when you found out what we had been building, what the merger was structured on? Was there a moment when you thought about using it, deliberately, against us?" The question sat between us on the table, like something she had been carrying in her pocket all evening and had finally set down. I took my time answering because she deserved a real answer and not a quick one. I said, "No." She waited. I said, "The deed was never a weapon, Constance. It was just my life, what Hattie left me, what I built on top of it, what I signed my name to across 20 years of documents I read every line of. I was not saving it for anything. I was living in it. The fact that your family built a proposal on top of an assumption you never verified, that was not my strategy. That was your oversight." Something moved across Constance's face, not offense. Something closer to the expression of a person who asked a question hoping for one answer and found themselves relieved by another. She said, "I needed to know if you were like me." I understood what she meant. She had spent 30 years using what she held, money, position, access, influence, as instruments of control and quiet punishment. She needed to know if I had done the same, if the woman she had wronged had simply been waiting with her own set of instruments, pointed in the other direction. I said, "I am not like you, Constance, but I don't think you're beyond being something different than what you've been." She nodded once. She stood. She straightened her jacket with both hands the way women do when they are concluding something and need a moment to collect themselves without showing it. Then she walked back to her seat beside Linwood. I watched her go. Then I turned back to the floor where my son was dancing with his wife, and I let myself be still inside the moment the way I have rarely allowed myself to be still inside anything. I thought about Reuben, not the loss of him. I have made my peace with carrying that, and I will carry it until I don't. I thought about him the way Hattie taught me to think about him, as someone who moved forward through the people he left, as someone whose love did not stop when he did. Alcy was out there on that floor because Reuben and I had chosen each other when choosing was hard. That choosing produced a man worth every year of what it cost. I thought about the name card, about what it said, about what it should have said. The card said poor. The The card said uneducated. The card said living off her son. What it should have said, what I would have written myself if anyone had thought to ask, is this: Marlise Caldwell, owner of the land your assumptions were built on, mother of the man you could not buy, daughter-in-love of the woman who saw me clearly, and the only person in that room who already knew how this story was going to end.